The hospital break room hummed with early morning activity. Steam rose from freshly brewed coffee as nurses and staff settled in, chatting about their weekends or complaining about the workload ahead. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Elena Carter adjusted her scrubs and tied her blonde hair back, preparing herself for another day of demanding but meaningful work. As she reached for her coffee, snippets of conversation caught her ear. "Did you see the new patient list? Another one of them showed up," muttered Maggie, her voice low but filled with disdain. Elena stiffened, pretending not to hear. She knew what Maggie meant by them. Racial tension in this hospital had always simmered just below the surface, but moments like these reminded Elena how deeply rooted it was. She poured her coffee, determined to focus on her patients, not the prejudice around her. The conference room buzzed with tension as head nurse Deborah stood at the front, clipboard in hand. She began assigning cases for the day, her sharp eyes scanning the room. When she got to James Wilson, the murmurs began. "A 32-year-old black male with a severe leg infection," Deborah announced. Her tone carried a hint of reluctance, as if just mentioning the case was controversial. "Let them handle their own," whispered someone in the back. Deborah ignored the comment, her eyes landing on Elena. "Elena, you're taking this one." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Maggie scoffed loudly. "Of course, give it to Saint Elena," she sneered. Elena glanced around, feeling the weight of her colleagues' stares. She nodded at Deborah. "I'll take care of it." "Good," Deborah said curtly, moving on to the next patient. Elena entered the patient's room, a small, sterile space with white walls and a single window overlooking the parking lot. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic. James Wilson lay on the bed, his dark skin pale from fatigue, his leg wrapped in blood-stained gauze. He glanced at her with suspicion, his jaw tightening. "Hi, Mr. Wilson. I'm Nurse Carter. I'll be taking care of you today," she said, her voice calm and professional. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes studying her like a hawk assessing a threat. "Guess I drew the short straw, huh?" he finally said, his tone defensive. Elena hesitated, her heart sinking at the bitterness in his voice. "No straw involved. I'm here to help you get better." James snorted, but said nothing more. Elena moved to check his vitals, careful to explain every step as she worked. By the time she left, he still hadn't softened, but she could sense a flicker of curiosity behind his guarded exterior. Elena returned to the nurse's station to update James's chart. Maggie stood nearby, leaning against the counter with a smug expression. "So, how's your pet project?" Maggie asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Elena didn't look up. "He's a patient, not a project." Maggie rolled her eyes. "You know what I mean. Why waste your energy? He probably doesn't even want your help." Elena slammed the chart closed, her patience wearing thin. "He's a human being, Maggie. That's all that should matter." Maggie's smirk faded into a scowl, but she said nothing more as Elena walked away. When Elena returned to James's room, she noticed the trash can overflowing, the floor unswept. She found the janitor in the hallway, leaning against his mop. "Room 312 hasn't been cleaned," she said firmly. The janitor shrugged. "Not my priority." Elena clenched her fists, swallowing her anger. "Fine, I'll do it myself." She spent the next 20 minutes cleaning the room, scrubbing the floor, and emptying the trash. James watched her from the bed, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes, I do," she replied without looking up. Later that afternoon, Elena sat by James's bedside, checking his foreline. He watched her closely, his brows furrowed. "Why are you doing all this?" he asked suddenly. She paused, meeting his gaze. "Doing what?" "Acting like you care," he said, his tone edged with suspicion. "I've seen how people around here look at me. You're not like them." Elena sighed, setting the foreline aside. "Because it's my job to care, and because you deserve it." James studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Okay." That evening, as Elena made her final rounds, she found James awake, staring out the window. "Do you need anything?" she asked. He shook his head but hesitated. "You ever listen to jazz?" Elena blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Sometimes." "Why?" "I used to play," he said, his voice softer now. "Saxophone. Haven't touched it in years." Elena smiled. "You should pick it up again when you're better." James snorted, but it wasn't bitter this time. "We'll see." The next morning, Elena was called into Deborah's office. "You're putting a lot of time into Mr. Wilson," Deborah said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "He needs proper care, just like anyone else," Elena replied. Deborah leaned back in her chair. "Be careful, Elena. You're drawing attention." Elena's jaw tightened. If standing up for a patient draws attention, maybe it's time this place changes. Deborah said nothing, her expression unreadable. As Elena left the office, she felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The break room was unusually quiet when Elena walked in for her morning coffee. Maggie and a few other nurses stood in a corner, whispering, their voices barely audible but sharp. "I don't understand why she's so invested," Maggie muttered. "It's not like he's going to thank her." Elena poured her coffee, ignoring the knot forming in her stomach. The hostility was growing louder, more direct. As she left, she overheard another comment. If she likes them so much, maybe she should work at their clinics. She paused in the hallway, gripping her cup tightly, before heading back to James's room. James winced as Elena adjusted his foreline. "Legs killing me," he muttered through gritted teeth. Elena frowned. The infection was clearly causing him severe pain. She left to consult Dr. Mitchell about increasing his pain medication. "Isn't he already on enough?" Dr. Mitchell asked, barely glancing up from his tablet. "He's in significant pain, and the current dose isn't helping," Elena argued. Mitchell sighed. "Look, I've seen cases like this before. We don't want to risk dependency." Elena clenched her fists. "This isn't about dependency. It's about basic care." Mitchell waved her off. "Noted, Nurse Carter. But the answer is no." Later that afternoon, James's sister and mother arrived to visit, their faces etched with worry. As they approached the reception desk, a security guard blocked their path. "Family hours are over," he said coldly. "It's barely 2 p.m., James's sister protested. "We're here to see my brother." "Rules are rules," the guard replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Elena watched the exchange from a distance, her chest tightening. She quickly approached James's family and led them through a back hallway to his room. "Thank you," his mother whispered, her voice breaking. Elena nodded, vowing silently to keep fighting. The tension around her began to take its toll. As Elena administered James's antibiotics, she realized with a jolt of panic that she had forgotten to log the previous dose. Deborah noticed the omission during her rounds and immediately called Elena into her office. "This kind of oversight is unacceptable," Deborah said sternly. "I understand you're under pressure, but you need to keep your focus." Elena apologized, her cheeks burning with shame. As she left the office, she vowed not to let her frustration cloud her judgment again. In the waiting room, a white patient's family argued loudly with James's mother and sister, accusing them of causing a scene. Security intervened, but instead of de-escalating, they asked James's family to leave. Elena found James's mother in tears outside the hospital. "We just wanted to see him," she said, her voice trembling. Elena escorted them back inside through a side entrance, her anger simmering. She made a mental note to document the incident for future reference. That evening, James opened up more as Elena changed his bandages. He told her about his childhood, his passion for jazz, and his dream of opening a small music school. "I just want to play again," he said softly. "But if I lose this leg—" "You're not going to lose it," Elena interrupted, her voice firm. "We're going to get through this." For the first time, James smiled, a small, fleeting expression, but one that gave Elena hope. Elena requested a specific piece of equipment to help with James's wound care. When it arrived, she discovered it was the wrong item, rendering it useless. She confronted Maggie, who smirked. "Oh, was that for your VIP patient? My bad." Elena's anger boiled over. "This isn't a game, Maggie. You could have jeopardized his recovery. Maggie shrugged. Maybe you should double-check next time. Elena stormed out, determined to stay ahead of the sabotage. Later that night, Elena cornered Maggie in the hallway. "You're letting your prejudice endanger a life," Elena said, her voice low but seething with anger. "How do you justify that?" Maggie crossed her arms. "You think you're so much better than the rest of us, don't you?" Newsflash, Elena. No one's asking you to play hero. This isn't about being a hero, Elena shot back. It's about doing what's right. And if that makes me unpopular, so be it. She walked away, her heart pounding, knowing the battle was far from over. The following morning, Elena entered James's room and immediately noticed something was wrong. His usually calm breathing was labored, his face pale and coated in sweat. She checked his vitals, and her stomach dropped. His fever had spiked dangerously overnight. "James, can you hear me?" she asked, gently shaking his shoulder. He groaned faintly but didn't open his eyes. The infection was worsening, likely exacerbated by the delayed treatments and environmental neglect. Elena rushed to find Dr. Mitchell, who was chatting casually with a group of residents. "James Wilson's fever has spiked to 104, she interrupted, urgency in her voice. Mitchell raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. "We'll monitor it. Adjust his fluids." "He needs immediate intervention," Elena pressed. "We're risking septic shock." Mitchell sighed, glancing at the clot. "I'll look into it after my rounds." Elena's frustration boiled over. "He doesn't have time to wait." Mitchell's expression hardened. "You're out of line, Nurse Carter. Let me do my job." Elena stormed back to James's room, her mind racing with options. She couldn't stand by while bureaucratic indifference endangered his life. After ensuring James was stable for the moment, Elena retreated to the break room and began compiling a detailed report. She documented every incident, the missed cleanings, the sabotage supplies, and Dr. Mitchell's dismissive attitude. She included timestamps, names, and her own notes. The following morning, she handed the report to Deborah during her rounds. Deborah scanned the pages, her face unreadable. "This is serious, Elena. If you're wrong—" "I'm not," Elena interrupted. "This isn't just neglect, it's systemic. If we don't act now, we'll lose him." Deborah sighed, setting the report aside. "I'll escalate it, but you're making waves. Don't expect this to end quietly." As Elena returned to James's room, a younger nurse, Liam, stopped her in the hallway. He looked around nervously before speaking. "I saw your report," he said quietly. "You're right. Things aren't fair here." Elena crossed her arms, skeptical. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want to help," Liam said earnestly. "I've kept my head down, but I can't anymore." Elena nodded slowly. "If you're serious, I could use your help. Start by ensuring James gets the supplies he needs. No delays, no mistakes." Liam nodded and hurried off. For the first time in days, Elena felt a glimmer of hope. Later that day, Elena returned to the break room and found a folded note tucked into her locker. Curious, she opened it, and her heart sank. "Stay in your lane, or you'll regret it." Her hands trembled as she crumpled the paper. She looked around the room, but no one met her gaze. The note confirmed what she already knew. She had enemies, and they were watching. Elena took a deep breath, steeling herself. She couldn't back down now. By evening, James's fever had started to stabilize. His breathing was still shallow, but the worst seemed to have passed. "You're tougher than you look," Elena said softly, adjusting his pillow. James managed a weak smile. "You too." Elena chuckled. "You're not allowed to scare me like that again." "Guess I'll try to behave," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The small moment of levity lifted Elena's spirits. She wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. James was still in the fight too. The next day, Elena noticed a subtle shift. Liam had spoken to a few other nurses, and while they didn't openly side with her, they began treating James with more professionalism. His room was cleaned without her intervention, and his medications arrived on time. Elena approached Liam during a quiet moment. "Thank you. I don't know what you said, but it's making a difference." Liam shrugged. People just needed a push. No one wants to be the first to speak up. Elena smiled. Sometimes being first is the hardest part. During her rounds, Elena spotted Dr. Mitchell outside James's room, talking to Deborah. She approached them, her resolve firm. "Dr. Mitchell, we need to escalate James's treatment," she said directly. "His fever is under control for now, but his infection could rebound." Mitchell frowned. "We've been over this, Nurse Carter. I know what I'm doing." "With all due respect, do you?" Elena countered. "Because your delays have nearly cost him his life twice." Deborah stepped between them. "Enough. Dr. Mitchell, I've reviewed Nurse Carter's report, and I agree. Further intervention is necessary. Prepare the antibiotics." Mitchell looked stunned, but nodded reluctantly. "Fine." Elena felt a surge of triumph, though she knew the fight wasn't over. That evening, Deborah called Elena into her office. "You've made progress," Deborah said, her tone cautious. "But you've also made enemies." Elena sat across from her, her posture tense. "If doing my job makes me enemies, so be it." Deborah sighed. "I admire your conviction, but be careful, Elena. The hospital administration doesn't like disruptions." "I'm not trying to disrupt anything," Elena said firmly. "I'm trying to save a life." Deborah nodded slowly. "Then keep doing what you're doing, but watch your back." As Elena left the office, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. The tide was starting to turn, but the cost was becoming clearer. The next morning, as Elena entered the hospital lobby, she was met with an unexpected scene. James's family, flanked by neighbors and friends, stood outside the hospital holding signs. The messages were clear: indiscrimination, equal treatment for all patients, and justice for James Wilson. A local journalist interviewed James's sister, who spoke passionately. "We're tired of being treated like second-class citizens. My brother almost died because this hospital ignored his needs. Enough is enough." Elena stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. The quiet injustice she had been battling was now on public display. She hurried to James's room, only to find him watching the scene unfold on the local news. "Did you know about this?" she asked. James shook his head, his expression conflicted. "I didn't want them to make a fuss, but maybe they're right." Elena placed a hand on his shoulder. "They're standing up for you, and for everyone who's been treated unfairly. That's nothing to be ashamed of." Later that day, Elena noticed a shift in the hospital's atmosphere. The staff was unusually quiet, their usual gossip replaced by tense whispers. Deborah called an emergency staff meeting. "The hospital administration is aware of the protest outside," Deborah began, her tone clipped. "Effective immediately, there will be an internal review of our patient care policies. This includes staff conduct." Maggie rolled her eyes. "So now we're supposed to walk on eggshells because a bunch of protesters showed up?" Elena stood up. "No, we're supposed to do our jobs without letting prejudice cloud our judgment." The room fell silent. For the first time, Elena saw a flicker of uncertainty on Maggie's face. Deborah cleared her throat. "That's enough. Let's focus on patient care and leave the politics to administration." As the meeting ended, Liam approached Elena. "You're making a difference," he said quietly. "People are starting to see it." The following day, a team of administrators and legal representatives arrived at the hospital to investigate. They interviewed staff, reviewed patient records, and inspected the facilities. Elena was called into a small conference room where she faced two administrators. "Nurse Carter, we've reviewed your report," one of them said. "It's thorough and troubling." Elena nodded. "I just want to ensure that all patients receive the care they deserve." "We're implementing immediate changes," the second administrator added. "But we need you to remain discreet during this process." Elena bristled. "Discreet? This isn't about protecting reputations. It's about saving lives." The administrators exchanged glances, but didn't respond. As Elena left the room, she resolved to keep pushing for accountability. The investigation yielded swift action. Maggie was placed on suspension pending further review, and Dr. Mitchell was reassigned to a different department. When Maggie saw Elena in the hallway, she sneered. "Hope you're happy, Saint Elena. You ruined my career." Elena stopped, her voice steady. No, Maggie. You did that yourself. The confrontation left her shaken, but the knowledge that justice was being served kept her moving forward. James's condition steadily improved under the new treatment plan. The infection began to subside, and his energy returned bit by bit. You're looking better, Elena said one morning as she checked his vitals. Feeling better too, James replied, his smile genuine this time. I owe you a lot, Nurse Carter. You don't owe me anything, Elena said. Just promise me you'll pick up that saxophone again. James laughed. Deal. A week later, Deborah approached Elena at the nurse's station. Administration wants to recognize you for your efforts, Deborah said, her tone almost grudging. There's a commendation ceremony next month. Elena shook her head. I don't need recognition. I just need this hospital to change. Deborah softened slightly. It already is. Thanks to you. The hospital began rolling out mandatory diversity and ethics training for all staff. Posters emphasizing equality and respect appeared in the hallways, a visible reminder of the changes taking place. Elena noticed the difference in small ways. A cleaner who now smiled at James's family, a nurse who stopped to chat with him during rounds. The shift was slow, but it was real. On James's discharge day, Elena helped him into a wheelchair, his legs still bandaged but healing well. His family waited eagerly in the lobby, their faces beaming with relief and gratitude. Thank you, James said, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. Elena smiled, tears welling in her eyes. Take care of yourself, James, and don't forget our deal. As she watched him reunite with his family, Elena felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The battle had been exhausting, but it had been worth it. She turned back to the nurse's station, ready for the next challenge. Change was slow, but it had begun, and she wasn't done fighting. The protest outside had subsided, leaving behind a tense but subdued atmosphere inside the hospital. James was no longer the center of gossip. He had been discharged with a clean bill of health. Yet, the repercussions of Elena's actions were far from over. As Elena walked through the hallways, she noticed Maggie's absence, the empty locker where her nameplate once hung. Liam caught up to her, whispering, "The administration is meeting with the staff this week. People are scared." "Good," Elena replied quietly. "They should be." During her lunch break, Elena sat alone in the break room. The usual buzz of conversation was replaced by hushed voices and furtive glances in her direction. Maggie's friends avoided eye contact, but their presence was palpable. Elena overheard fragments of their whispered conversations. "Think she's next?" And, "She brought this on herself." Liam joined her, setting his tray down with a loud thud. "Don't let them get to you," he said. "They're just angry they can't get away with things anymore." Elena managed a small smile. "Thanks, Liam, but it feels like I'm fighting this alone." "You're not," Liam said firmly. "Some of us see what you're doing, and we're with you, even if we're not loud about it." A week after his discharge, James returned to the hospital, not as a patient, but as a visitor. Elena was surprised to find him waiting for her at the nurse's station, a cane in hand, but a wide smile on his face. "James!" she exclaimed, genuinely happy to see him. "Had to come back and thank you properly," he said, handing her a small package. Inside was a framed photo of him holding his saxophone, the symbol of his recovery and hope for the future. "I'm going to start playing again," he said proudly. "Thanks to you." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "I didn't do it alone." "You did more than enough," James replied. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That afternoon, Deborah called Elena into her office. "Elena, I need to warn you," Deborah began, her expression serious. "While some staff members are supportive, there's pressure from certain board members to handle the situation. They're worried about the hospital's reputation." "Handle?" Elena repeated, her voice sharp. "What does that mean?" Deborah sighed. "They're reviewing your record. If they find even a small mistake, they could use it against you." Elena leaned forward, her jaw tightening. "Let them review. I stand by everything I've done." "Just be careful," Deborah said softly. "You've stirred the pot, and now they're looking for someone to blame." A few days later, Maggie returned from her suspension, her demeanor icy and hostile. She avoided direct confrontations, but made her disdain clear through passive-aggressive comments. "I see the Princess of Justice is still here," Maggie muttered to a colleague as Elena walked by. Elena paused, then turned to face her. "You're back because this hospital is giving you a second chance. Maybe you should use it to reflect." Maggie's eyes narrowed. "You think you've won? This place will never change, no matter how hard you try." "We'll see," Elena replied calmly before walking away. Elena was assigned a new patient, a young black woman named Tamara with severe asthma exacerbated by environmental factors. The parallels to James's case were undeniable, and Elena quickly noticed the same patterns of neglect creeping in. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Liam and a few other staff members stepped in to ensure Tamara received proper care, from timely medications to a clean room. When Elena thanked Liam, he shrugged. "You showed us how to do the right thing. Now it's our turn." The local media continued to follow James's story, and Elena's role began to attract attention. A reporter approached her one evening as she left the hospital. "Nurse Carter, do you have any comments about the changes happening at the hospital?" Elena hesitated, wary of drawing more attention to herself. "I'm just doing my job," she said carefully. "The real story is about the patients who deserve better, and the people fighting to make that happen." Her response was measured, but the next morning, she saw her name in the headlines, "The Nurse Who Sparked Change." At the end of a long shift, Elena sat in the empty break room, staring out the window at the city lights. She felt a deep sense of exhaustion, but also pride. The fight had taken a toll on her, alienating colleagues, drawing scrutiny from higher-ups, but it had also sparked something greater. Deborah entered the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," she said, sitting beside Elena. "Thanks," Elena murmured, taking a sip. "You've done something remarkable," Deborah said after a moment. "This place isn't the same as it was a month ago." "It's still far from perfect," Elena replied. "True," Deborah admitted, "but change doesn't happen overnight. You've planted the seed." Elena nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I just hope it grows." The atmosphere in the hospital grew increasingly polarized. Some staff members quietly supported Elena's efforts, while others doubled down on their hostility. The tension hung thick in the air, an invisible battle line drawn between those who embraced change and those who resisted it. As Elena reviewed a patient's chart at the nurse's station, a passing orderly muttered under his breath, "Traitor." She ignored it, focusing on her work. But the strain was evident. Liam approached her later, concern etched on his face. "They're trying to wear you down," he said. "Don't let them." Elena forced a smile. "I've come too far to stop now." That afternoon, Elena was surprised to see Tamara, the young black asthma patient, sitting up in bed, speaking animatedly with her mother. When Elena entered the room to check her vitals, Tamara smiled brightly. "Nurse Carter," Tamara said, her voice still raspy but full of energy. "You're the only one who's treated me like a real person." Elena's heart swelled. "It's my job to take care of you." Tamara shook her head. "It's more than that. My mom told me what's been going on here. You're fighting for people like me, aren't you?" Elena hesitated, then nodded. "Everyone deserves fair treatment." Tamara's mother reached for Elena's hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've done more than you know." Later that evening, Liam convinced Elena to attend a meeting with the nurses' union. The small conference room was packed with staff members, their faces a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and determination. One of the union representatives, a seasoned nurse named Carol, stood at the front. "We've all seen what's happening," she began. "Elena Carter has shown a light on issues we've ignored for too long. It's time we take a stand." The room erupted in murmurs. Maggie, seated near the back, scoffed loudly. "What? We're supposed to put ourselves on the line because of her?" Carol raised a hand for silence. "This isn't just about Elena. It's about all of us. About creating a hospital where every patient and every staff member is treated with dignity." Elena hesitated, then stood up. "I didn't start this to make waves," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I just wanted to do what's right, but if we stand together, we can make real change." To her surprise, the room broke into applause, small at first, but growing louder. Even Maggie seemed momentarily taken aback. The next morning, Elena was summoned to a meeting with the hospital's administrative board. The room was sterile and imposing, with a long table and several sharply dressed executives. "Nurse Carter," began Mr. Simmons, the hospital's director, "we've reviewed the recent events and your involvement. While your intentions are commendable, your actions have disrupted the workplace." Elena's heart pounded. Disruption was necessary to address the inequities in patient care. Simmons frowned. "While we appreciate your dedication, we must also maintain order. Consider this a formal warning. Further insubordination will result in disciplinary action." Elena clenched her fists under the table, but maintained her composure. "If advocating for patients is insubordination, then I'll accept whatever consequences come my way." As she left the meeting, Liam was waiting in the hallway. "How bad was it?" "They're trying to scare me," Elena said, her voice firm, "but I'm not backing down." The same day, Elena received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Maria Alvarez, a respected surgeon who had largely stayed out of the hospital's conflicts. "I've been watching you," Dr. Alvarez said, her tone warm but serious. "You've shown more courage than most of us. I think it's time I got involved." Elena blinked in surprise. "Why now?" "Because change doesn't happen without allies," Dr. Alvarez replied. "And you've proven it's worth fighting for." The two women began brainstorming ways to push for systemic reform, from policy changes to staff training programs. For the first time in weeks, Elena felt she wasn't alone. A few days later, Elena encountered Maggie in the break room. To her surprise, Maggie didn't sneer or make a snide comment. Instead, she approached cautiously, her expression unreadable. "I still don't agree with everything you've done," Maggie said, her voice low. "But I might have gone too far. I wanted to say sorry." Elena studied her, searching for insincerity, but found none. "Thank you," she said simply. "I hope you'll think about why this fight matters." Maggie nodded stiffly and walked away, leaving Elena to wonder if the apology marked a turning point, or just a moment of guilt. The hospital administration, under mounting pressure from public scrutiny, announced a press conference to address the ongoing controversy. Deborah asked Elena to attend, though the decision was voluntary. As cameras flashed and reporters jostled for position, Mr. Simmons stepped to the podium. "We acknowledge that our hospital has fallen short in providing equitable care. Effective immediately, we will implement new policies to address these shortcomings." Elena, seated in the audience, felt a mix of relief and skepticism. When Simmons invited her to speak, she hesitated but ultimately stood. "This is a step in the right direction," she said, her voice steady. "But real change requires accountability and commitment from all of us." Her words were met with applause, and for the first time, Elena felt like her fight had reached beyond the hospital walls. That evening, Elena sat in her small apartment, sipping tea as she reflected on the day. The press conference had been a victory, but the road ahead was still long. Her phone buzzed with a message from James. "Saw you on the news. You're amazing. Thank you again." Elena smiled, her resolve strengthening. The fight had taken so much from her. Friends, comfort, even her sense of security. But it had given her something greater, purpose. As she prepared for bed, she glanced at the photo James had given her, now proudly displayed on her desk. The saxophone gleamed in the image, a reminder of what perseverance could achieve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Elena was ready. Change wasn't easy, but it was always worth it. Elena arrived early at the hospital, the sunlight barely peeking over the horizon. She paused at the entrance, staring at the building that had become both her battleground and her purpose. Despite everything, the hostility, the isolation, the pressure, she felt a renewed determination. Change was beginning to take root. Inside, she found Liam waiting for her by the nurse's station. "Big day today," he said, holding up a clipboard. "The diversity training starts this afternoon." Elena smiled faintly. It's a start. It's more than that, Liam replied. It's because of you. The hospital's first mandatory diversity and inclusion training brought together staff from every department. A professional facilitator led the session, presenting stark statistics about racial disparities in healthcare and offering tools to combat unconscious bias. Elena sat near the back, observing her colleagues. Some listened attentively, their expressions thoughtful. Others, like Maggie, sat stiffly with crossed arms, their resistance palpable. The facilitator broke the group into smaller teams for an exercise. Elena was paired with Maggie and 2 other nurses. The task: share a time when they'd witnessed or experienced discrimination. I guess I'll go first, Elena said, recounting her experience with James. She spoke candidly about the neglect she had witnessed and the pushback she faced trying to address it. When she finished, Maggie surprised her. I didn't think about it like that, Maggie admitted, her voice subdued. Maybe I should have. It wasn't an apology, but it was progress. Later that afternoon, Elena visited Tamara, who was preparing to be discharged. The young woman had regained her strength, her eyes bright with gratitude. I wanted to thank you, Tamara said, gripping Elena's hand, not just for taking care of me, but for standing up for people like me. Elena shook her head. I just did what anyone should. No, Tamara insisted. You did what most people wouldn't. That matters. Tamara's words stayed with Elena as she left the room. They reminded her why she had fought so hard and why the fight wasn't over. Elena was called into another meeting with Mr. Simmons. This time, Dr. Maria Alvarez joined her as an advocate. We've been monitoring the changes, Simmons began, his tone guarded. While there has been progress, some staff members feel the reforms are being forced on them too quickly. Elena frowned. Are you suggesting we slow down? Simmons leaned back in his chair. I'm suggesting we balance change with stability. Dr. Alvarez spoke up, her voice firm. This isn't about comfort. It's about justice. If the staff can't adapt, perhaps the problem lies with them, not the reforms. Simmons shifted uncomfortably, but didn't argue. Elena left the meeting feeling both vindicated and wary. The administration's reluctance was a reminder of how fragile progress could be. That evening, as Elena prepared to leave, Maggie approached her in the break room. She hesitated before speaking, her usual bravado replaced by something more vulnerable. I've been thinking, Maggie began, staring at the floor, about what you said, about what I've done. Elena folded her arms, unsure where this was going. And I was wrong, Maggie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I let my bias get in the way of my work, and it hurt people. Elena was stunned. She had never expected this level of self-awareness from Maggie. Acknowledging it is the first step, she said carefully. The next step is doing better. Maggie nodded. I will. Over a late-night coffee in the break room, Liam pitched an idea to Elena. What if we started a mentorship program? Pair senior staff with newer employees to teach empathy and accountability. Elena tilted her head, intrigued. That's actually a great idea. Liam grinned. I thought you'd like it. I'll draft a proposal and pitch it to Deborah. As they brainstormed, Elena felt a surge of hope. For the first time, she wasn't just reacting to problems. She was helping create solutions. The next day, Elena found herself in the middle of a conflict between 2 patients, a black man and a white woman, both of whom claimed the last available bed in a semi-private room. The woman's family insisted their relative had priority. When Elena reviewed the admissions log, she saw that the man had been waiting longer. She calmly explained this to the woman's family, but they erupted in anger. This is discrimination against us, one of them shouted. You're just playing favorites. Elena stood her ground. Our policy is first come, first served. This isn't about favorites, it's about fairness. The family stormed off to file a complaint, but Elena refused to compromise her principles. That evening, Elena sat in the hospital courtyard, watching the sunset. Dr. Alvarez joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. You've done something remarkable here, Dr. Alvarez said, handing Elena a cup. But I know it hasn't been easy. Elena sipped her tea, her gaze distant. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. For every step forward, there's so much resistance. Change is never easy, Dr. Alvarez replied, but it's always worth it. Look around. This hospital isn't the same place it was when you started this fight. Elena nodded slowly, the weight of her journey pressing on her, but balanced by a growing sense of accomplishment. I just hope it lasts. It will, Dr. Alvarez assured her, because you've planted something that can grow. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long, but she was ready to keep walking it. The calm progress Elena had begun to see was shattered by an emergency. A young black boy, Marcus, was rushed into the ER with a severe asthma attack. His mother, frantic and in tears, begged for immediate help. Elena sprang into action, quickly assessing Marcus's condition. She called for an inhaler and steroids, but there was a delay in getting the necessary equipment. Elena ran to the supply room herself, only to find the shelves unorganized, with essential items misplaced or missing. When she returned, Marcus was gasping for air, his lips turning blue. "Stay with me," she whispered, administering the inhaler just in time. Marcus's breathing stabilized, and his mother broke down in tears of relief. Later, Elena documented the incident, citing the systemic neglect that had nearly cost Marcus his life. "This can't happen again," she wrote in her report, her pen trembling with anger. The incident with Marcus became a tipping point. Elena approached Deborah and Dr. Alvarez with her findings. "This isn't just about training or policies," Elena said, her voice firm. "We need structural changes, better oversight, better resource allocation." Dr. Alvarez nodded. "We'll need to bring this to administration." When they presented their case to Mr. Simmons, Elena didn't hold back. "The disorganization in this hospital is costing lives. Marcus was lucky, but luck shouldn't be what keeps patients alive." Simmons looked uncomfortable, but finally relented. "We'll review the processes and implement stricter protocols." It wasn't a full victory, but it was a step forward. Liam's mentorship program was officially approved, and Elena was assigned her first mentee, a young nurse named Kayla, who was eager but inexperienced. During their first meeting, Kayla asked nervously, "Is it true what they say about you, that you stood up to everyone for that patient?" Elena chuckled. "I stood up for what was right, and you will too, if you remember that every patient deserves your best." Kayla nodded earnestly. "I want to learn everything I can from you." Elena felt a surge of pride, realizing that the seeds she had planted were beginning to grow. A few weeks later, a similar situation arose with another black patient who was being ignored in triage. This time, Kayla noticed the neglect and immediately flagged it to Elena. Together, they intervened, ensuring the patient received prompt care. Kayla later said, "I couldn't just stand by. It didn't feel right." Elena smiled. "That's how it starts." The incident demonstrated that the hospital's culture was beginning to shift. Staff members who once turned a blind eye were now stepping up, inspired by Elena's example. Word of the hospital's reforms began to spread, drawing attention from local media and healthcare advocates. A journalist approached Elena for an interview. "You've become something of a hero," the reporter said. "How does that feel?" Elena shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a nurse who believes in doing the right thing. The real heroes are the patients who trust us despite everything." The article that followed highlighted Elena's role in sparking change, but it also emphasized the collective effort of the hospital's staff to improve care. For Elena, it was a perfect balance. Maggie approached Elena in the break room one evening, a folder in her hands. "I've been working on something," she said hesitantly. Inside the folder was a proposal for a staff-driven committee to address patient care issues. "I thought maybe we could work on this together," Maggie said, her tone uncharacteristically soft. Elena raised an eyebrow. "You're serious about this?" Maggie nodded. "I want to do better, and I think this is a good start." Elena smiled, extending her hand. "Let's do it." It was a small moment, but it marked a significant turning point for both women. The hospital organized a community health fair to rebuild trust with the local population. Free checkups, workshops, and health resources were offered to everyone, regardless of race or income. Elena volunteered to lead a workshop on managing chronic conditions, while Liam and Kayla ran a booth on preventative care. James and Tamara attended, sharing their stories and encouraging others to seek the care they deserved. As Elena looked around at the bustling event, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The hospital wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. As the day wound down, Elena sat in her car, reflecting on everything that had happened. The road to change had been exhausting and fraught with challenges, but it had also been deeply rewarding. Her phone buzzed with a text from Liam. "We're lucky to have you. Thanks for showing us what's possible." Elena smiled, typing back, "We're just getting started." As she drove home, she thought about the future. Not just for herself, but for the hospital, her colleagues, and the patients who would walk through its doors. The fight for equity wasn't over, but Elena was ready to continue it, one step at a time. The hospital buzzed with activity as staff gathered for a town hall meeting. This was the first of its kind, a discussion to reflect on recent changes and chart the path forward. Elena sat near the front with Liam, Kayla, and Dr. Alvarez. Deborah began the meeting. "This hospital has faced challenges, but we've also seen incredible growth. Today, we're here to talk about what's next." She invited Elena to speak. As Elena rose, the room grew silent. She glanced around, seeing a mix of familiar faces, some supportive, others wary. "Change is hard," Elena began, "but it's necessary. What we've started here is just the beginning. It's up to all of us to keep it going." Her words were met with applause, and for the first time, she felt the collective energy of her colleagues aligning with her vision. After the meeting, Elena was approached by a group of staff members, including Maggie and a senior nurse named Claire, who had been skeptical of the reforms. "We want to form a working group to focus on patient care equity," Claire said. "Will you help us?" Elena smiled. "Of course. This is exactly what we need." The group met weekly to brainstorm ideas, including a mentorship expansion, regular training sessions, and a patient feedback system. The meetings became a hub for collaboration, breaking down barriers between staff who had previously been divided. Maggie surprised Elena with her dedication, often staying late to finalize proposals. "I guess I'm making up for lost time," Maggie said one evening. "You're doing more than that," Elena replied. "You're helping lead." Kayla had grown under Elena's mentorship, and it showed. One day, she handled a particularly difficult case. A Black teenager with a complicated medical history whose parents were initially hesitant to trust the hospital. Kayla took the time to explain every step of the treatment plan, earning the family's trust. When the teenager's condition stabilized, the parents thanked her profusely. Later, Kayla told Elena about the experience. "It felt good," she said, "to know I made a difference." "You did," Elena replied, "and you'll keep making a difference." Kayla's success reinforced Elena's belief that the future of the hospital was in good hands. One morning, Elena received an unexpected email from Mr. Simmons, requesting her presence at a board meeting. Nervous but curious, she attended. "We've been watching the changes you've helped implement," Simmons said. "The mentorship program, the Committee on Equity, the improved patient outcomes. It's impressive." He handed her a certificate of recognition. "We'd like to formally acknowledge your contributions to the hospital." Elena accepted the certificate with a mix of pride and humility. "Thank you," she said, "but this is a team effort. I couldn't have done it alone." As she left the meeting, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Her work was finally being validated. A few weeks later, Elena was surprised to find James waiting for her in the hospital lobby, holding a small, wrapped package. "I heard about everything you've done," he said. "I wanted to give you something." Inside the package was a framed photo of the two of them from the health fair, alongside a note. "Thank you for fighting for people like me. You made a difference." Elena blinked back tears. "James, this means so much to me." "You've done more for me than I could ever repay," James replied. "But I thought you'd like a reminder of what you've accomplished." A Black patient named Mr. Johnson arrived in the ER with severe abdominal pain. Unlike before, his case was handled swiftly. The triage nurse flagged it as urgent. The attending physician consulted specialists immediately, and Elena noticed that every staff member involved treated him with respect and professionalism. As Mr. Johnson was prepped for surgery, Elena checked in with the team. "Great work, everyone," she said, feeling a swell of pride. The system was finally functioning as it should. One evening, Elena stayed late to review the mentorship program's progress. Liam joined her, bringing coffee. "You've done something amazing here," he said. "When you started this, did you think it would get this far?" Elena shook her head, smiling. "Honestly, no. I just wanted to make sure James got the care he deserved. But once you start fighting, it's hard to stop." Liam grinned. "Well, you've inspired a lot of people, including me." As they worked, Elena realized how far they had come, not just as a hospital, but as individuals. The next day is Elena walking through the hospital. The hallways, once filled with tension and hostility, now carried a sense of purpose and collaboration. Nurses and doctors worked together seamlessly, and patients of all backgrounds received attentive care. Elena stopped by Kayla's station, where the young nurse was mentoring a new recruit. She smiled, seeing the cycle of mentorship continuing. In the courtyard, Elena found Dr. Alvarez waiting for her. "The board approved the Permanent Equity Committee," Dr. Alvarez said. "You've changed this place." "It wasn't just me," Elena replied. "It was all of us." As the two women watched the sunset, Elena felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight wasn't over, but the foundation had been laid. She knew the hospital would continue to grow and improve long after her time there.